So even if you get away with it, right? I did fine this one time. That's inconsequential to whether what we did is morally permissible or not.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Out of the Box podcast. We are super excited today because we have a special guest here on with us. Along with my co-host Theo, we have one of our really great professors from St. Mary's University. And so Professor Chelstrom, if you'd like to introduce yourself, just tell us a little bit about you and, what you teach and all that fun stuff.
Cool. Yeah, I'm Eric Chelstrom. I'm, my Ph.D. is from the University of Buffalo in the SUNY system or the New York system. I do some research on things like oppression. I have a music degree, so I kind of got into philosophy by figuring, that philosophers maybe didn't have the best things to say about music. I've come around on a lot of those things, so it's kind of where I was as a naive undergraduate when I was way back in the day. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at St. Mary's, and I'm also now one of the co-directors of the new first-year experience as St. Mary's begins to roll out its new core this year.
Awesome. Yeah, well, thank you for coming on today. We're super excited to talk about today. Steele, what is the topic of the day?
Yeah, so first thing is let's talk about moral relativism. So what subjective morality, moral relativism is. I guess we could probably start with that and then jump into different views of it. So,
Sure. Yeah. So the way that a lot of people would define something like subjective moral relativism is that something is moral if and only if the subject herself believes it. So if you hold to or committed to a position, then that whatever that is, that's moral for you. So that would be the normal way in which that particular form of relativism would get defined. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that or if you want me to just kind of roll ahead.
Yeah, we can jump.
I have too much to say sometimes. So
no, that's why you're here, man. No, definitely. That's what I've understood it to be as well. It's kind of people coming up, lack of a better term, coming up with their own morality and their own moral rules, perchance, and then. So yeah, morality is defined by the individual, if I have that correctly, right?
Yeah, on that particular model. Now, most of us don't think that model has any merit to it because it has heaps and heaps of problems. The biggest one might be something along the lines of that morality is something where we're bound with regard to our actions and attitudes towards other people. So, right there, that my personal belief or personal judgment has no check against other people would be one of those big flaws of that kind of way of thinking about what it would mean to be moral.
And if we continue, because this is a big movement that's happening, the relativism, just everyone has their own morality. You can believe what you believe. I believe what I believe. And so if we continue going in this path, well, what are the things that we can start seeing in our society that can start causing conflicts?
So what I would say, I don't know if moral relativism itself would cause conflicts because it's just a belief about what is good or not, or permissible or not, or obligatory or not. So the causal language might be just a little strong. But what I would say is that a lot of conflict where people refuse to engage, refuse to talk to one another, or refuse to be tolerant of some of the legitimate differences, and I think there's quite a bit of room there, morally speaking. For a lot of differences, those are cases where relativism is going to sort of incline a subject, if they're inclined towards it, to retreat into some kind of sort of self-serving attitude where they feel like entitled that they can do what they want with their people or to other people, or they don't have to care about other people. So if it's something simple as like a public health issue, right? If you're a subjective moral relativist, then your belief is good enough, right? Whatever that is. But if your belief is contrary to the good of public health or the common good in some more general sense, if we're just talking generally, then, whatever you're going to be inclined to do is not necessarily going to have to take into account the harms you may be contributing to other people or the risks of harms that you're exposing them to. And so things like, is it permissible to drink and drive? Most of the people would say no, especially at whatever level it means to be intoxicated, which is, as we learned from the science, is pretty low. It doesn't take very much. And, if I think, oh, no, it's cool, whatever, then I might be inclined or less worried about the potential consequences or harms I might expose other people to. So even if you get away with it, right? I did fine this one time. That's inconsequential to whether what we did was morally permissible or not. Because again, it's not just the actual harms that we contribute to other people, but the potential risk of harm. And as we do things like get intoxicated and try to drive or operate heavy machinery, we're going to increase the level of risk we're exposing others to.
Right. So in the subjective morality point of view, they could argue, well, anyone should be able to drive drunk because this person believes it, and they should be able to do it because that's what subjective morality is. And I'm gathering, you're arguing that would create the problem of, well, then people could just drive drunk and there's going to be consequences, but they don't need to be held liable, I guess, for those consequences if they believe in that, I guess.
Well, that would be their argument, right? If that's what they believe. Now, somebody else could believe that it's wrong, but it would be only morally binding on the individual, right? Your judgment would only cover you, instead of the idea that maybe what we were aiming for, if we want to be good moral agents, is to have our judgments align with whatever's true, broadly speaking, however we want to kind of cash that out. So, it'd be one of those issues too, that also where the law, would be a separate concern from morality, potentially.
Yeah. For example, if something, since this topic tends to be very personal to someone's morality, how about if somebody is harming themselves in a certain way? Would that be morally right objectively, or how?
I mean, I guess that's a good question. So normally, one of the what we would call meta-ethical principles, or principles that would seem to be required of any viable normative moral theory, or a theory that tells us what we should or should not do, would be something like what we call the harm principle, where it's going to say, you have license to act and operate up until you start causing harms to self or other. Now, the trouble with something like the harm principle, why it might be, as stated, needs a little tweaking or something like that, or has some clarification or disambiguation that needs to be done, is something like you say, your example is a good one, but it's going to depend on the nature of the harm to some extent. So, if I'm just harming myself and there's nothing else, no other good that comes from it, then clearly that's probably going to be morally impermissible. But if there are other goods that come from it that are tangible in some way, shape, or form, then it's less clear. And one way to think about this is to think about things like delayed gratification. Or if you think about, like, a lot of people, when you're in the middle of studies, for example, right, it can get very stressful, you're losing sleep, you're anxious. It's not the most fun always, right? And even though we'd like to make it that way, right, it's there's times in which you really got to do a lot of work and it's hard. But that, those kinds of potential, anxieties or whatever, if we want to tally them as harms, don't outweigh the goods that an education brings you in terms of the capacity to make better judgments in the long haul. Same thing with things like, taking your medicine or something like this. Is you may not like the taste of the medicine going down, it's not pleasant, but the payoff of being restored to health is better than that slight discomfort, if again we want to call that a harm. Now, some people would argue that's not really a harm, but that gets into exactly what's difficult about it, or what needs to be disambiguated is what constitutes a harm.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah, like weighing the costs and benefits, weighing the harms and benefits, I guess. So what are some other philosophical issues with moral relativistic thinking?
Yeah, so there's a good number of issues that particular framework faces, things that really kind of bury it into quite a deficit. So one is what we might say is an issue of moral progress, or the lack thereof. So if morality really is subjective, meaning just by whatever I believe at a given point in time is what's morally binding to me and no one else, and whatever you believe and vice versa. Well, then, if I change my mind, I haven't made progress, morally speaking. I've just altered the moral universe. Now, if we look at this in terms of the big picture, we want to sort of look at it in a more cultural context. What that would mean is if these types of approaches to thinking about how we might define what is or is not moral are correct, then someone like Martin Luther King Jr., who today is hailed pretty universally as, a really good example of a moral reformer who helps initiate a significant moral progress. A lot of us think the civil rights movement made a lot of progress, for example. I don't mean to be, I'm not saying that as a political statement. I think just extending more rights to more people is a good thing. But if relativism is true, then King is not a good person, or he was not, right? A good person, because if you look at his approval ratings before his assassination, as his family will point out, when people try to celebrate him in certain ways today, it was sort of forgetting what he was up to. Like, you can't have your cake and eat it too. He was very significantly, by a substantial majority of people in the United States, disliked, right? They thought he was a bad person because they thought that the things he was advocating for were bad. Now, if we think we've made progress on those issues, even if it's an imperfect progress, but we think it's even capable of making progress, and we think that someone like King did good by helping sort of push us in that direction, and he's not alone, there's plenty of others, then relativism is not going to help us figure that out, because relativism is to say he is bad, you might think he's good, but your view now is binding again only to you, and your judgment is limited then to you. It's like saying I like this or that. Sort of reduces moral claims to I like this or I like that, which is not what moral claims seem to be about.
So that's interesting what you're mentioning, that it doesn't allow for progress to happen when you have relativism, because it's like starting fresh from scratch, trying to make your own moral concepts from now. But if you don't take any ideas from past philosophers or people who have created moral structures, then that doesn't move the ball forward in that sense of figuring out what is good and what is bad.
Right. Yeah, moral progress is a tricky one, because it may actually be the case that there isn't such a thing in the big picture of what we call moral progress. And the general problem underlying it that isn't just unique to moral relativism is, as we change the yardstick, so to speak, what we're measuring, we can't measure with one thing, A, and then say, no, now we're going to measure with B and say that there's progress, right? Because if we've changed from A to B as our unit of measure, whatever that is, we're not measuring the same thing anymore. And so, maybe, moral progress is not about stable values. Maybe moral progress is more subtle and refined to the extent that it might be possible. Or maybe it's really complicated.
Yeah.
Would be the hard thing. Yeah.
That's true. Yeah. Because I still wrestle with that, like between objective and subjective morality, and trying to figure out how objective morality comes to be in a society, in a civilization. I remember looking at this psychological, like a book I had to read in psychology, and it said something like there were statistics that showed there's some universal moral beliefs across cultures. I wonder if you could, if you know anything about that. Or...
Yeah. So there are pretty consistent cross-cultural values, what we might say. So it's not necessarily that the specific moral judgment is always the same. This thing is good or this thing is bad. So one example we can pull just to kind of look at this is, why are there prohibitions against things like eating shellfish in kosher or halal diets, right? And that's a moral prescription, not just a religious prescription in those cases, to a lot of believers in those systems, I should say, just to qualify it fully. If you look at the specific value that norm is trying to uphold, it's something about health and hygiene, and health, and in this case, because if you're looking at where those peoples are indigenous to, or those religions are indigenous to more specifically, well, you don't have refrigeration in those days. Shellfish is not something that's going to be very stable in a desert environment. It's going to produce, in all likelihood, sufficient bacteria that's going to make you ill. So that value, not necessarily the specific outcome of how we interpret or apply that value of that we ought to maintain health, or we ought to avoid harming the bodily integrity of other people, or we ought to avoid problems with property to the extent that we think property is a defensible value, right? Those types of things are the types of things that we'll see with regard to sort of universal or quasi-universal values that are held out there. That we can see this empirically, that there's a lot of overlap.
Do you think that since we are human beings, there is, in a sense, like natural laws that we just abide by? We understand that life is life, and that feeding yourself and doing exercise is good for the body. So people across cultures understand that movement and all of that encompasses good health, and maybe to a certain degree a longer life, or promotes health, like we were talking about. And so do you think that a lot of the morals that we carry tend to be I guess come from our nature?
So that's a good question, because what that gets to is, and the way that I like to think about this and frame this, and this will vary from different theorists, is to try to think of like what's fundamental of a particular moral framework. So there's a number of competing objective or more objective, moral frameworks out there that have some viability, have some cachet, and have a legitimate shot, we might say, in terms of weighing out the theory selection process, whatever that would mean in this case. And one of those contenders that comes up is natural law, as you know. And what natural law defines moral goods in terms of is whatever counts as natural. Now, natural law's problem is it's not clear what we mean by natural in this case. So what exactly constitutes something as being natural versus unnatural? And if you look at humans, for example, as a biological species on Earth bound by other kind of prescriptions, variation is the rule. There's 7 billion of us, and that's 7 billion variations, and that those variations range over all sorts of things in terms of the different things that affect different people's bodies. So which one of those counts as natural, or do they all count as natural? The other thing natural law tends to do that can get a little tricky for that particular framework, and some alternatives could be you could value pleasures and pains. That's kind of how utilitarians go about it. You could value sort of the goodness of a particular action as it's justifiable according to reason, which is the way that deontologists might go about it. You could value character, which is the way the virtue theorists go about it. Or you could value like caring relationships and community building types of things, right? There's a number of alternatives. But with regard to natural law, another tweak it's got, or an issue it's got, is this question of how it defines the relevant function is. Because usually what you'll find in natural law framework is it'll say something is natural, right? Then it's good, and it's natural if and only if it fulfills some kind of proper function. And they get that from people like Aristotle and the virtue theorists, where they're getting that reasoning from. But Aristotle's always clear that he means like species level for function. So good or bad human being is based on whatever we define humanity in relationship to. Good or bad function in terms of natural law, it gets ambiguous because we could talk about the function of the heart, we can talk about the function of the brain. So we're talking about organs, species, we're talking about your relationship in a species, and all of those are places where functions are nailed down, and so it gets fuzzy. And so in that sense, it's a framework that's got some challenges to it.
Yeah, that makes sense. It branches out into so many things that you can't just use yourself as an example, because like you said, there's so many variations of us, and so who's the standard, right?
Challenge is finding out what is natural and what is not, and how do you who's to say that you can draw the line, is what I'm hearing on that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a definite trouble of sort of nailing down what would constitute a good definition in that case. Yeah.
Right.
And that each of us, our inclination is as I was saying, is like our inclination is to use ourself as a yardstick. And of course that's always problematic because, we only represent at best, a small subset of maybe half or less than half of the population.
Right. Mm-hmm. Jose, you were going to say something?
No, it makes me think of so many things because, to that point, if sometimes we consider ourselves to be that small, area of what we're basing our morality on, then that means if we tend to be surrounded by people that are like-minded or just think the same way, that can lead to believing that is the right thing to do or that you yourself are doing good when, in hindsight, it could be actually harming others.
Yeah, and that makes me wonder if you go on like another island or a planet or whatever, morality starts over. So how do you explain that,
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, right? There's one intuition that's right, clearly, I think, is that, context and circumstance matters to some extent. But where I think a lot of us slip, or what hasn't trickled down through, is that we can understand that objectively, right? We can say that this is an objective relationship. And when these types of things light up these ways, then these judgments are what we ought to make in terms of holding ourselves to some stable, standard that applies intersubjectively. So that if we're on another planet and there's very different conditions, so one example I gave once upon a time that I talked at Texas State, having to do with like interstellar space travel and stuff like this, Dr. Bry is really into as well, that like, look, if you're in like a space-bound environment, interstellar travel, like there's all sorts of new norms that you have to adopt in terms of specifics, because the environment you're in is extremely tenuous and dangerous, right? So like no firearms in space, because if you blow a hole in the hull, everybody dies. So you've got to, or at least no, concussive firearms in the way that we have them. You'd have to scale it back somehow, right? So that it wouldn't have the ability to puncture the hull or something like this. You've got recycled water systems, right, in that kind of environment, because you have to survive. And so, yeah, as we change the sort of locality and the local objective properties of what we're facing, we're going to have to see different judgments. Maybe the values still remain stable, though. And so it's figuring out how do we, think through whatever those stable values are, identifying them first, and then, figuring out how they apply under a particular set of constraints.
Right. So in some sense, morality in that way maybe develops from survival mechanisms to preserve life.
Yeah, there are evolutionary approaches to thinking about morality too. They tend to take that natural law approach that Jose was mentioning earlier. They just define humanity instead of on, so in the Catholic tradition, right, natural law is the big thing. And they define it in terms of biblical or scriptural and theological prescripts in terms of how they think of humanity. Evolutionary approaches will tend to think about it in terms of biology. But, that's also kind of unstable, since evolutionary is an ongoing process. That every time we, produce new offspring, we're pushing that forward in little steps. Every time there's new environmental things that trigger mutations in somebody, we're pushing things forward little steps. I don't mean forward here like we're necessarily getting better, just forward in like something's happening that may or may not have, greater survival capacity or greater fitness relative to a particular set of objective constraints in an environment.
Right. Evolution is changing. So, yeah, that's it on our time. So, Jose, what is your
I don't know. I think my final thought was just, I've been reading up a little bit more on, cryptocurrency, not being subject to a certain government. And so it's free to do almost whatever it wants. It's not really reigned by anyone. And so it makes me think, how that's going to work morally, since, there's really nobody there as authority, then how that's going to play out. So.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, that would be an interesting question. I don't know much about cryptocurrency, but I mean, so, whether we need someone to tell us, I don't know. And that's true of morality too. It's not necessarily someone telling us what is or is not.
It's almost
Right?
like
It's
when the pilgrims came to the US,
Mhm.
there wasn't really like a king or, a certain authority. It was just, people coming in and people building the government in itself, right?
Yeah. I mean, you could have kind of spontaneous order or a sort of quasi-spontaneous order, and it can kind of be self-regulatory. The trouble, when it's self-regulatory, I think why a lot of us fall back on wanting some authority in the matter or some expertise in the matter is, when things get messy, when people aren't compliant, especially people in charge, or who have a greater share of power or something, then it's very hard to know what to do in those cases because, people are getting harmed. And if the people who have the most power don't care, that's seriously problematic. So there may be objective standards that are just kind of baked into structures of sort of how relationships between things in the world work. But, it's on us to recognize them and to sort of reinforce them to the extent that makes sense. And to have a healthy debate, right, about that so that we recognize that, we can always be mistaken and that there are ways to go about, refining our judgment in these ways, even if it doesn't arrive at an ultimate answer.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. All right,
That's
Jose.
awesome. Sounds good. Well, thank you very much, Professor Chelstrom, for being here on the show. We really appreciate your time and we really appreciate everything that you got to share with us today. And look forward to having you on a future show as well.